Chapter 11, Delivery. 11.1 The importance of delivery. As we stated in Chapter 1, some surveys indicate that many people claim to fear public speaking more than death, but this finding is somewhat misleading. No one is afraid of writing their speech or conducting the research. Instead, people generally only fear the delivery aspect of the speech, which, compared to the amount of time you will put into writing the speech, days, hopefully, will be the shortest part of the speech-giving process, 5 to 8 minutes, generally, for classroom speeches. The irony, of course, is that delivery, being the thing people fear the most, is simultaneously the aspect of public speaking that will require the least amount of time. Consider this scenario about two students, Bob and Chris. Bob spends weeks doing research and crafting a beautifully designed speech that, on the day he gets in front of the class, he messes up a little because of nerves. While he may view it as a complete failure, his audience will have gotten a lot of good information and most likely written off his mistakes due to nerves, since they would be nervous in the same situation. Chris, on the other hand, does almost no preparation for his speech, but, being charming and comfortable in front of a crowd, smiles a lot while providing virtually nothing of substance. The audience takeaway from Chris's speech is, "I have no idea what he was talking about," and other feelings ranging from, "he's good in front of an audience," to, "I don't trust him." So the moral here is that a well-prepared speech that is delivered poorly is still a well-prepared speech, whereas a poorly written speech delivered superbly is still a poorly written speech. Despite this irony, we realize that delivery is what you are probably most concerned about when it comes to giving speeches, so this chapter is designed to help you achieve the best delivery possible and eliminate some of the nervousness you might be feeling. To do that, we should first dismiss the myth that public speaking is just reading and talking at the same time. You already know how to read, and you already know how to talk, which is why you're taking a class called Public Speaking, and not one called Public Talking, or Public Reading. Speaking in public has more formality than talking. During a speech, you should present yourself professionally. This doesn't necessarily mean you must wear a suit or dress up, unless your instructor asks you to. However, it does mean making yourself presentable by being well-groomed and wearing clean, appropriate clothes. It also means being prepared to use language correctly and appropriately for the audience and the topic, to make eye contact with your audience, and to look like you know your topic very well. While speaking has more formality than talking, it has less formality than reading. Speaking allows for flexibility, meaningful pauses, eye contact, small changes in word order, and vocal emphasis. Reading is a more or less exact replication of words on paper without the use of any nonverbal interpretation. Speaking, as you will realize if you think about excellent speakers you have seen and heard, provides a more animated message. 11.2 Methods of speech delivery. What follows are 4 methods of delivery that can help you balance between too much and too little formality when giving a speech. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses, but you will most likely want to focus on the extemporaneous approach, since that is probably what your instructor will want from you. Impromptu speaking. Impromptu speaking is the presentation of a short message without advanced preparation. You have probably done impromptu speaking many times in informal, conversational settings. Self-introductions in group settings are examples of impromptu speaking. "Hi, my name is Steve, and I'm a volunteer with the Homes for the Brave program." Another example of impromptu speaking occurs when you answer a question such as, "What did you think of the movie?" Your response has not been pre-planned, and you are constructing your arguments and points as you speak. Even worse, you might find yourself going into a meeting and your boss says, "I want you to talk about the last stage of the project." And you have no warning. The advantage of this kind of speaking is that it's spontaneous and responsive in an animated group context. The disadvantage is that the speaker is given little or no time to contemplate the central theme of his or her message. As a result, the message may be disorganized and difficult for listeners to follow. Here is a step-by-step guide that may be useful if you are called upon to give an impromptu speech in public. 1. Take a moment to collect your thoughts and plan the main point or points you want to make. 2. Thank the person for inviting you to speak. Do not make comments about being unprepared, called upon at the last moment, on the spot, or uneasy. No one wants to hear that, and it will embarrass others and yourself. 3. Deliver your message, making your main point as briefly as you can while still covering it adequately and at a pace your listeners can follow. 4. Stay on track. Answer the question or prompt as given. Resist the temptation to go elsewhere. 5. If you can, use a structure, using numbers if possible. 2 main reasons, or 3 parts of our plan. Or 2 side effects of this drug. Past, present, and future or East Coast, Midwest, and West Coast are common structures. 6. Thank the person again for the opportunity to speak. 7. Stop talking. It is easy to ramble on when you don't have something prepared. If in front of an audience, don't keep talking as you move back to your seat. Impromptu speeches are generally most successful when they are brief and focus on a single point. Manuscript speaking is the word-for-word iteration of a written message. In a manuscript speech, the speaker maintains his or her attention on the printed page except when using visual aids. The advantage to reading from a manuscript is the exact repetition of original words. In some circumstances, this can be extremely important. For example, reading a statement about your organization's legal responsibilities to customers may require that the original words be exact. In reading one word at a time, in order, the only errors would typically be mispronunciation of a word or stumbling over complex sentence structure. A manuscript speech may also be appropriate at a more formal affair, like a funeral, when your speech must be said exactly as written in order to convey the proper emotion or decorum the situation deserves. However, there are costs involved in manuscript speaking. First, it's typically an uninteresting way to present. Unless the speaker has rehearsed the reading as a complete performance animated with vocal expression and gestures, well-known authors often do this for book readings, the presentation tends to be dull. Keeping one's eyes glued to the script prevents eye contact with the audience. For this kind of straight manuscript speech to hold audience attention, the audience must be already interested in the message and speaker before the delivery begins. It is worth noting that professional speakers, actors, news reporters, and politicians often read from an autocue device, such as a teleprompter, especially when appearing on television, where eye contact with the camera is crucial. With practice, a speaker can achieve a conversational tone and give the impression of speaking extemporaneously and maintaining eye contact while using an autocue device. However, success in this medium depends on 2 factors. 1. The speaker is already an accomplished public speaker who has learned to use a conversational tone while delivering a prepared script, and 2. The speech is written in a style that sounds conversational and in spoken rather than written, edited English, for example, with shorter sentences and clearer transitions. For the purposes of your public speaking class, you will not be encouraged to read your speech. Instead, you will be asked to give an extemporaneous presentation. Extemporaneous speaking is the presentation of a carefully planned and rehearsed speech, spoken in a conversational manner using brief notes. By using notes rather than a full manuscript, the extemporaneous speaker can establish and maintain eye contact with the audience and assess how well they are understanding the speech as it progresses. And since you will be graded, to some degree, on establishing and maintaining eye contact with your audience, extemporaneous speaking can be extremely beneficial in that regard. Without all the words on the page to read, you have little choice but to look up and make eye contact with your audience. In some cases, your instructor will require you to prepare strong preparation and speaking notes, outlines as a foundation for your speech. This topic is addressed in Chapter 6. Speaking extemporaneously has some advantages. It promotes the likelihood that you, the speaker, will be perceived as knowledgeable and credible since you know the speech well enough that you don't need to read it. In addition, your audience is likely to pay better attention to the message because it is engaging both verbally and nonverbally. It also allows flexibility. You are working from the strong foundation of an outline, but if you need to delete, add, or rephrase something at the last minute or to adapt to your audience, you can do so. The outline also helps you be aware of main ideas versus subordinate ones. The disadvantage of extemporaneous speaking is that in some cases it does not allow for the verbal and the nonverbal preparation that are almost always required for a good speech. Adequate preparation cannot be achieved the day before you're scheduled to speak, so be aware that if you want to present a credibly delivered speech, you will need to practice many times. Because extemporaneous speaking is the style used in the great majority of public speaking situations, most of the information in the subsequent sections of this chapter is targeted toward this kind of speaking. Memorized speaking is the rote recitation of a written message that the speaker has committed to memory. Actors, of course, recite from memory whenever they perform from a script. When it comes to speeches, memorization can be useful when the message needs to be exact and the speaker doesn't want to be confined by notes. The advantage to memorization is that it enables the speaker to maintain eye contact with the audience throughout the speech. Being free of notes means that you can move freely around the stage and use your hands to make gestures. If your speech uses visual aids, this freedom is even more of an advantage. However, there are some real and potential costs. First, unless you also plan and memorize every vocal cue, the subtle but meaningful variations in speech delivery, which can include the use of pitch, tone, volume, and pace, gesture, and facial expression, your presentation will be flat and uninteresting, and even the most fascinating topic will suffer. You might end up speaking in a monotone or a sing-song repetitive delivery pattern. You might also present your speech in a rapid, machine gun style that fails to emphasize the most important points. Second, if you lose your place and start trying to ad-lib, the contrast in your style of delivery will alert your audience that something is wrong. If you go completely blank during the presentation, it will be extremely difficult to find your place and keep going. Obviously, memorizing a typical 7-minute classroom speech takes a great deal of time and effort, and if you aren't used to memorizing, it is very difficult to pull off. Realistically, you probably will not have the time necessary to give a completely memorized speech. However, if you practice adequately, you will approach the feeling of memorized while still being extemporaneous. As we said earlier, for the purposes of this class you will use extemporaneous speaking. Many professional speakers who are paid to make speeches use this approach because, while they may largely know what they want to say, they usually make changes and adjustments based on the audience or event. This approach also incorporates most of the benefits of memorized speaking, knowing what you want to say, being very thoroughly rehearsed, and manuscript speaking, having some words in front of you to refer to, without the inherent pitfalls those approaches bring with them. 11.3. Preparing for your delivery. In the 1970s, before he was an author, playwright, and film actor, Steve Martin was an up-and-coming stand-up comedian whose popularity soared as a result of his early appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and Saturday Night Live. As Martin notes in his autobiography, Born Standing Up, 2008, as the audiences for his act got bigger and bigger, he needed to adapt his delivery. Some promoters got on board and booked me into a theater in Dallas. Before the show, I asked one of them, "How many people are out there?" 2,000, he said. 2,000? How could there be 2,000? That night I did my usual bit of taking people outside, but it was starting to get dangerous and difficult. First, people were standing in the streets, where they could be hit by a car. Second, only a small number of the audience could hear or see me. Could Charlton Heston really have been audible when he was addressing 1,000 extras? Closing parenthesis. Third, it didn't seem as funny or direct with so many people. I reluctantly dropped it from my repertoire. p.168. Martin's audiences would grow to be around 50,000 at the height of his popularity as a stand-up comedian, again requiring him to make adjustments to his delivery. He began wearing his iconic all-white suit so that people in the nosebleed seats at his shows could still see his frenetic movements from afar. Most of us will never speak to so many people at once, but even though you don't expect an audience of such size, you should still be prepared to adapt to the setting in which you will speak. Your audiences, circumstances, and physical contexts for public speaking will vary. At some point in your life, you may run for public office or rise to a leadership role in a business or volunteer organization. Or you may be responsible for informing coworkers about a new policy, regulation, or opportunity. You may be asked to deliver remarks in the context of a worship service, wedding, or funeral. You may be asked to introduce a keynote speaker or simply to make an important announcement in some context. Sometimes you will speak in a familiar environment, while at other times you may be faced with an unfamiliar location and have very little time to get used to speaking with a microphone. Being prepared to deal with different speaking situations will help reduce anxiety you may have about giving a speech. So let's look at factors you need to keep in mind as you prepare for your speech in this class, as well as future speeches you may need to give. A lectern is a small raised surface, usually with a slanted top, where a speaker can place notes during a speech. While a lectern adds a measure of formality to the speaking situation, it also allows speakers the freedom to do two things: to come out from behind the lectern to establish more mediate contact with the audience and to use both hands for gestures. By the way, this piece of furniture is often mistakenly called a podium, which is a raised platform or stage. However, for inexperienced speakers who feel anxious, it is all too tempting to grip the edges of the lectern with both hands for security. You might even wish you could hide behind it. Be aware of these temptations so you can manage them effectively and present yourself to your audience in a manner they will perceive as confident. One way to achieve this is by limiting your use of the lectern to a place to rest your notes only. Try stepping to the side or front of the lectern when speaking with free hands, only occasionally standing at the lectern to consult your notes. This will enhance your eye contact as well as free up your hands for gesturing. Figures 11.1 to 11.3 give some examples of posture for speaking with a lectern. Speaking in a small or large physical space. If you are accustomed to being in a classroom of a certain size, you will need to make adjustments when speaking in a smaller or larger space than what you are used to. A large auditorium can be intimidating, especially for speakers who feel shy and exposed when facing an audience. However, the maxim that proper preparation prevents poor performance is just as true here as anywhere. If you have prepared and practiced well, you can approach a large venue speaking engagement with confidence. In terms of practical adjustments, be aware that your voice is likely to echo, especially if far fewer people are in the space than it can hold, so you will want to speak more slowly as well as more loudly than usual and make use of pauses to mark the ends of phrases and sentences. Similarly, your facial expressions and gestures should be larger so that they are visible from farther away. If you are using visual aids, they need to be large enough to be visible from the back of the auditorium. Of course, if the speaker can get the audience to move to the front, that is the best situation, but it tends not to happen. Limited space is not as disconcerting for most speakers as enormous space, and it has the advantage of minimizing the tendency to pace back and forth while you speak. A small space also calls for more careful management of note cards and visual aids, as your audience will be able to see up close what you are doing with your hands. Do your best to minimize fumbling, including setting up in advance or arriving early to decide how to organize your materials in the physical space. Of course, if you have any control over the location of the presentation, you should choose one that fits the size of your audience. Speaking outdoors. Outdoor settings can be charming, but they are prone to distractions. If you're giving a speech in a setting that is picturesquely beautiful or prone to noise such as from cars, it may be difficult to maintain the audience's attention. If you know this ahead of time, you might plan your speech to focus more on mood than information and perhaps to make reference to the lovely view. More typically, outdoor speech venues can pose challenges with weather, sun glare, and uninvited guests, such as insects and pigeons. If the venue is located near a busy highway, it might be difficult to make yourself heard over the ambient noise. You might lack the usual accommodations, such as a lectern or table. Whatever the situation, you will need to use your best efforts to project your voice clearly without sounding like you're yelling or straining your voice. In the best outdoor situation, you will have access to a microphone. Using a microphone. Most people today are familiar with microphones that are built into video recorders, phones, and other electronic devices, but they may be new at using a microphone to deliver a speech. One overall principle to remember is that a microphone only amplifies, it does not clarify. If you are not enunciating clearly, the microphone will merely enable your audience to hear amplified mumbling. Microphones come in a wide range of styles and sizes. Generally, the easiest microphone to use is the clip-on style worn on the front of your shirt or blouse. These are commonly referred to as a lavalier mic, which is a brand name. If you look closely at many television personalities and news anchors, you will notice these tiny microphones clipped to their clothing. They require very little adaptation. You simply have to avoid looking down at your notes, for instance, because your voice will be amplified when you do so. If you have to use a handheld microphone, making gestures and using notes becomes very difficult. Lectern and handheld microphones require more adaptation. If they're too close to your mouth, they can screech. If they're too far away, they might not pick up your voice. Some microphones are directional, meaning that they are only effective when you speak directly into them. If there is any opportunity to do so, ask for tips about how to use a particular microphone. Also practice with it for a few minutes while you have someone listen from a middle row in the audience and signal whether you can be heard well. The best plan, of course, would be to have access to the microphone for practice ahead of the speaking date. Often a microphone is provided when it isn't necessary. If the room is small or the audience is close to you, do not feel obligated to use the microphone. Sometimes an amplified voice can feel less natural and less compelling than a direct voice. However, if you forego the microphone, make sure to speak loudly enough for all audience members to hear you, not just those in front. Audience size. A small audience is an opportunity for a more intimate, minimally formal tone. If your audience has only 8 to 12 people, you can generate greater audience contact. Make use of all the preparation you have done. You do not have to revamp your speech just because the audience is small. When the presentation is over, there will most likely be opportunities to answer questions and have individual contact with your listeners. One problem with a small audience is that some people will feel it is their right, or they have permission, to interrupt you or raise their hands to ask questions in the middle of your speech. This makes for a difficult situation, because the question may be irrelevant to your topic or cause you to go on a side track if answered. The best you can do is say you'll try to deal with that question at the end of the speech if you have time and hope they take the hint. Better, good rules should be established at the beginning that state there is limited time but discussion may be possible at the end. Your classroom audience may be as many as 20 to 30 students. The format for an audience of this size is still formal but conversational. Depending on how your instructor structures the class, you may or may not be asked to leave time after your speech for questions and answers. Some audiences are much larger. If you have an audience that fills an auditorium, or if you have an auditorium with only a few people in it, you still have a clearly formal task, and you should be guided as much as possible by your preparation. 11.3. Practicing your delivery. There is no foolproof recipe for good delivery. Each of us is unique, and we each embody different experiences and interests. This means each person has an approach, or a style, that is effective for her or him. This further means that anxiety can accompany even the most carefully researched and interesting message. But there are some techniques you can use to minimize that anxious feeling and put yourself in the best possible position to succeed on speech day. If you've ever watched your favorite college football team practice, you may have noticed that sometimes obnoxiously loud crowd noise is blaring over the speaker system in the stadium. The coaches know that the crowd, whether home or away, will be raucous and noisy on game day. So to prepare, they practice in as realistic an environment as possible. You need to prepare for your speech in a similar way. What follows are some general tips you should keep in mind, but they all essentially derive from one very straightforward premise. Practice your speech beforehand, at home or elsewhere, the way you will give it in class. Practice your speech out loud. We sometimes think that the purpose of practicing a speech is to learn the words and be prepared for what we will need to say. Certainly that is part of it, but practice also lets you know where potential problems lie. For example, if you only read your speech in your head, or whisper the words quietly, you're not really practicing what you will be doing in front of the class. Since you will be speaking with a normal volume for your assignment, you need to practice that way, even at home. Not only will this help you learn the speech, but it will help identify any places where you tend to mispronounce or stumble over words. Also, sentences on paper do not always translate well to the spoken medium. Practicing out loud allows you to actually hear where your sentences and phrases are awkward, unnatural, or too long, and allows you to correct them before getting up in front of the audience. Practice your speech standing up. In all the time that the authors of this book have been teaching speech, not once have either of us come into a classroom and seen a bed behind the lectern for students to speak from. This is to say that when you practice at home, lying on your bed reading your speech really only prepares you for one thing: lying on a bed reading a speech. Since you will be standing in front of your class, you need to practice that way. As we mention in more detail below, the default position for delivering a speech is with your feet shoulder width apart and your knees slightly bent. Practicing this way will help develop muscle memory and will make it feel more natural when you are doing it for real. We also suggest you wear the same shoes you will be wearing on the day of your speech. Practice your speech with a lectern. One of the biggest challenges with practicing a speech as you're going to give it is usually the fact that most of us don't own a lectern. This is problematic, since you don't want to practice giving your speech while holding your notes in front of you, because that is what will feel comfortable when you give your speech for real. So the solution is to practice your speech while standing behind something that approximates the lectern you will have in your classroom. Sometime this may be a kitchen counter or maybe even a dresser you pull away from the wall. One particularly creative idea that has been used in the past is to pull out an ironing board and stand behind that. The point is that you want to get experience standing behind something and resting your speech on it. Of course, if you really want to practice with an actual lectern, it might be worth the time to see if your classroom is empty later in the day or find out if another classroom has the same type of lectern in it. Practicing with the real thing is always ideal. Practice your speech with an audience. Obviously, on the day you give your speech, you will have an audience of your fellow students and your professor watching you. The best way to prepare for the feeling of having someone watch you while giving a speech is to have someone watch you while you practice giving a speech. We don't mean a collection of stuffed animals arranged on your bed or locking your pets in the room with you, but actual human beings. Ask your parents, siblings, friends, or significant other to listen to you while running through what you will say. Not only will you get practice in front of an audience, but they may be able to tell you about any parts that were unclear or problems you might encounter when you give it for a grade. Not to overcomplicate the issue, but remember that when you speak to your class, you will have an entire room full of people watching. Therefore, if you only have one person watching you practice, be sure to simulate an entire audience by looking around the room and not focusing on just that one person. When you give your speech for real, you will want to make eye contact with the people on the left side of the room as well as the right, with the people in the front as well as in the back. You also want the eye contact to be around 5 seconds long, not just a glance. The idea is that you are talking to individuals, not just a glob of people. During practice, it may help to pick out some strategically placed objects around the room to occasionally focus on just to get into the habit of looking around more often. Practice your speech for time. You will undoubtedly be given a time limit for each of your speeches, and points will probably be deducted from your grade if you go over or under that time. Therefore, you want to make sure you are well within time. As a general rule, if your speech window is 5 to 7 minutes, your ideal speech time is going to be 6 minutes. This gives you an extra 60 seconds at the beginning in case you talk very fast and race through it, and 60 seconds on the back end in case you get lost or want to add something at the last minute. If you practice at home and your 5 to 7 minute speech lasts 5:06, you are probably going to be in trouble on speech day. Most likely your nerves will cause you to speak slightly faster and put you under the 5 o'clock mark. If your times are vastly different, you may have to practice 4 or more times. When practicing your speech at home for time, it is a good idea to time yourself at least 3 times. This way you can see if you are generally coming in around the same time and feel pretty good that it is an accurate reflection of how long you will speak. Conversely, if during your 3 rehearsals your times are 5:45, 5:12, and 6:37, then that is a clear indicator that you need to be more consistent in what you are saying and doing. Although we are using examples of practicing for classroom speeches, the principle is even more important for non-classroom speeches. One of the authors had to give a very important presentation about the college to an accreditation board. She practiced about 15 times, to make sure the time was right, that her transitions made sense, that she was fluid, and that the presentational slides and her speech matched. Each time something improved. Practice your speech by recording yourself. There is nothing that gets us to change what we're doing or correct a problem more quickly than seeing ourselves doing something we don't like on video. Your instructor may record your speech in class and have you critique it afterwards, but it may be more helpful to do that in advance of giving your speech. By watching yourself, you will notice all the small things you do that might prove to be distracting and affect your grade during the actual speech. Many times students aren't aware that they have low energy or a monotone, moderate voice, or that they bounce, sway, pull at their clothes, play with hair or jewelry, or make other unusual and distracting movements. At least, they don't know this until they see themselves doing it. Since we are generally our own harshest critics, you will be quick to notice any flaws in your speech and correct them. It is important enough that it deserves reiterating. Practice your speech beforehand, at home or elsewhere, the way you will give it in class. Following these steps will not only prepare you better for delivering the speech, but they may also help reduce anxiety since you will feel more familiar with the situation you find yourself in when faced with a speaking engagement. Additionally, the more you speak publicly, whether for practice or in front of a live audience, the more fluid you will become for later speeches. 11.4. What to do when delivering your speech. The interplay between the verbal and nonverbal components of your speech can either bring the message vividly to life or confuse or bore the audience. Therefore, it is best that you neither overdramatize your speech delivery behaviors nor downplay them. This is a balance achieved through rehearsal, trial and error, and experience. One way to think of this is in terms of the Goldilocks paradigm. You don't want to overdo the delivery because you might distract your audience by looking hyper or overly animated. Conversely, someone whose delivery is too understated, meaning they don't move their hands or feet at all, looks unnatural and uncomfortable, which can also distract. Just like Goldilocks, you want a delivery that is just right. This middle ground between too much and too little is a much more natural approach to public speaking delivery. This natural approach will be covered in more detail in the following sections where we discuss specific aspects of your delivery and what you need to think about while actually giving your speech. Hands. Almost everyone who gives a speech in public gets scared or nervous to some extent. Even professionals who do this for a living feel that way, but they have learned how to combat those nerves through experience and practice. When we get scared or nervous, our bodies emit adrenaline into our systems so we can deal with whatever problem is causing us to feel that way. Unfortunately, you will need to be standing relatively still for the next 5 to 7 minutes, so that burst of adrenaline is going to try to work its way out of your body and manifest itself somehow. One of the main ways is through your hands. It may sound funny, but we have seen more than one student unknowingly incorporate jazz hands, shaking your hands at your sides with fingers opened wide, at various points in their speech. While certainly an extreme example, this and behaviors like it can easily become distracting. At the other end of the scale, people who don't know what to do with their hands or use them too little, sometimes hold their arms stiffly at their sides, behind their backs, or in their pockets, all of which can also look unnatural and distracting. The key for knowing what to do with your hands is to use them naturally as you would in normal conversation. If you were standing around talking to your friends and wanted to list 3 reasons why you should all take a road trip this weekend, you would probably hold up your fingers as you counted off the reasons. First, we hardly ever get this opportunity. Second, we can. Try to pay attention to what you do with your hands in regular conversations and incorporate that into your delivery. However, with all that said, if you have nothing else to do with your hands, such as meaningful gestures, the default position for them is to be resting gently on the sides of the lectern. See Figure 11.2. You don't want to grip the lectern tightly, but resting them on the edges keeps them in position to move your notes on if you need to or use them to gesture. As stated above, you want to practice this way beforehand so you are used to speaking this way when you come to class. Feet. Just like your hands, a lot of nervous energy is going to try to work its way out of your body through your feet. On the too much end, this is most common when people start dancing. Behind the lectern, another variation is twisting feet around each other or the lower leg. On the other end are those who put their feet together, lock their knees, and never move from that position. Both of these options look unnatural, and therefore will prove to be distracting to your audience. Locking your knees can also lead to loss of oxygen in your brain, not a good state to be in, because it can cause you to faint. The default position for your feet, then, is to have them shoulder-width apart with your knees slightly bent. See Figure 11.3. Again, you want to look and feel natural, so it is fine to adjust your weight or move out from behind the lectern, but constant motion, or perpetual stillness, will not lead to good overall delivery. These two sections on hands and feet mention energy. Public speakers need to look energetic, not hyperactive, but engaged and upbeat about communicating their message. The energy is part of the muscle memory we saw in Chapter 1. Slumping, low and unvarying pitch and rate, and lack of gestures telegraph, "I don't care," to an audience. Objects. There is a very simple rule when it comes to what you should bring with you to the lectern when you give your speech. Only bring to the lectern what you absolutely need to give the speech. Anything else you have with you will only serve as a distraction for both you and the audience. For the purposes of this class, the only objects you should need to give your speech are whatever materials you are speaking from, and possibly a visual aid if you are using one. Beyond that, don't bring pens, laptops, phones, Lucky Charms, or notebooks with you to the lectern. These extra items can ultimately become a distraction themselves when they fall off the lectern or get in your way. Some students like to bring their electronic tablet, laptop computer, or cell phone with them, but there are some obvious disadvantages to these items, especially if you don't turn the ringer on your cell phone off. Cell phones are not usually large enough to serve as presentation notes. We've seen students squint and hold the phone up to their faces. Not only do you need to be aware of what you bring with you, but you should also be aware of what you have on your person as well. Sometimes, in the course of dressing for a speech, we can overlook simple issues that can cause problems while speaking. Some of these can include jewelry that jingles when you move, such as heavy bracelets, uncomfortable shoes or shoes that you are not used to. Don't make speech day the first time you try wearing high heels, anything with fringe, zippers, or things hanging off it. They might become irresistible to play with while speaking. For those with longer hair, remember that you will be looking down at your notes and then looking back up. Don't be forced to fix your hair or tuck it behind your ear every time you look up. Use a barrette, hairband, or some other method to keep your hair totally out of your face so that the audience can see your eyes and you won't have to adjust your hair constantly. It can be very distracting to an audience to watch a speaker pull hair from his face after every sentence. The lectern and posture. We have already discussed the lectern, but it is worth mentioning again briefly here. The lectern is a tool for you to use that should ultimately make your speech easier to give, and you need to use it that way. On the too much end, some people want to trick their audience into thinking they are not nervous by leaning on the podium in a relaxed manner, sometime going so far as to actually begin tipping the podium forward. Your lectern is not part of your skeletal system to prop you up, so don't do this. On the too little end are those who are afraid to touch it, worried that they will use it incorrectly or somehow knock it over. You won't. Closing parenthesis. As always, you want the Goldilocks middle ground. As stated above, rest your notes and hands on it, but don't lean on the lectern or hug it. Practicing with a lectern, or something similar to a lectern, will eliminate most of your fears about using it. The lectern use is related to posture. Most of us let gravity pull us down. One of the muscle memory tricks of public speaking is to roll your shoulders back. Along with making your shoulder muscles feel better, doing so with feet apart and knees bent, rolling your shoulders back will lead to a more credible physical presence. You'll look taller and more energetic. You'll also feel better, and you'll have larger lung capacity for breathing to support your tone and volume. Eye contact. As we've said consistently throughout this book, your audience is the single biggest factor that influences every aspect of your speech. And since eye contact is how you establish and maintain a rapport with your audience during your speech, it is an extremely important element of your delivery. Your professor may or may not indicate a standard for how much eye contact you need during the speech, such as 50%, but he or she will absolutely want to see you making an effort to engage your audience through looking directly at them. What is important to note here is that you want to establish genuine eye contact with your audience, and not fake eye contact. There have been a lot of techniques generated for faking eye contact, and none of them look natural. For example, these are not good ideas. 3 points on the back wall. You may have heard that instead of making eye contact, you can just pick 3 points on the back wall and look at those. What ends up happening, though, is you look like you are staring off into space, and your audience will spend the majority of your speech trying to figure out what you are looking at. To avoid this, look around the entire room, including the front, back, left, and right sides of the space. The swimming method. This happens when someone is reading his or her speech and looks up quickly and briefly to try to make it seem like they are making eye contact, not unlike a swimmer who pops his head out of the water for a breath before going back under. Eye contact is more than just physically moving your head. It is about looking at your audience and establishing a connection. In general, your eye contact should last at least 5 seconds at a time and should be with individuals throughout the room. The stare down, since you will, to some degree, be graded on your eye contact. Some students think, either consciously or not, that the best way to ensure they get credit for establishing eye contact is to always and exclusively look directly at their professor. While we certainly appreciate the attention, we want to see that you are establishing eye contact with your entire audience, not just one person. Also, this behavior is uncomfortable for the instructor. Volume refers to the relative softness or loudness of your voice. Like most of the other issues we've discussed in this section, the proper volume for a given speaking engagement usually falls on the scale in figure 11.4. If you speak too softly, too little volume, your audience will struggle to hear and understand you and may give up trying to listen. If you speak with too much volume, your audience may feel that you are yelling at them, or at least feel uncomfortable with you shouting. The volume you use should fit the size of the audience and the room. Fortunately, for the purposes of this class, your normal speaking voice will probably work just fine since you are in a relatively small space with around 20 people. However, if you know that you are naturally a soft-spoken person, you will need to work on breathing to get more air into your lungs, and on projecting your voice to the people in the last row, not just those in the front. Of course, if you are naturally a very loud talker, you may want to make other adjustments when giving your speech. Obviously, this will all change if you are asked to speak in a larger venue or given a microphone to use. Public speaking relies on the voice for interest, credibility, audibility, and clarity. The British Prime Minister of the 19th century was quoted saying, "There is no greater index of character so sure as the voice." While that seems exaggerated today, a public speaker at any level cannot ignore the energy, loudness, and clarity in their voice. There are 4 steps to voice production. Breathing, produced by the lungs, which are largely responsible for the vocal characteristic of volume. Phonation, the production of the sound in the vocal folds, which close and vibrate to produce sound for speaking as the air is exhaled over them. Phonation creates pitch. Resonation, a type of amplification of the sound in the larynx, oral cavity, and nasal cavity, which creates the characteristic of quality. And articulation, which produces the sounds of language others can understand and is responsible for rate and for being understood. The visual in figure 11.5 shows a cutaway of these parts of the anatomy. Your instructor may give you more directions on maximizing the power of your voice to achieve more variety and power. In section 11.6 we include a vocal exercise for doing so. We have all listened to a low-energy, monotone, moderate speaker and know how hard it is, so you should pay attention to your recording, perhaps by closing your eyes and just listening, to see if your voice is flat and lifeless. Pitch is the relative highness or lowness of your voice, and like everything, you can have too much or too little, with regard to variation of it. Too much pitch variation occurs when people sing their speeches, and their voices oscillate between very high-pitched and very low-pitched. While uncommon, this is sometimes attributed to nerves. More common is too little variation in pitch, which is known as being monotone. Delivering a speech in a monotone manner is usually caused by reading too much. Generally, the speaker's focus is on saying the words correctly, because they have not practiced. They forget to speak normally to show their interest in the topic, as we would in everyday conversation. For most people, pitch isn't a major issue, but if you think it might be for you, ask the people in your practice audience what they think. Generally, if we are interested in and passionate about communicating our thoughts, we are not likely to be monotone. We are rarely monotone when talking to friends and family about matters of importance to us, so pick topics you care about. How quickly or slowly you say the words of your speech is the rate. Too little rate, i.e., speaking too slowly, will make it sound like you may not fully know your speech or what you are talking about, and will ultimately cost you some credibility with your audience. It may also result in the audience being bored and lose focus on what you are saying. Rate is one reason you should try to record yourself, even if just audio on your phone, beforehand, and be mindful of time when you practice. Your voice's rate will affect the time it takes to give the speech. By contrast, too much rate, i.e., speaking too fast, can be overly taxing on an audience's ability to keep up with and digest what you are saying. It sometimes helps to imagine that your speech is a jog or run that you and your friends, the audience, are taking together. You, as the speaker, are setting the pace based on how quickly you speak. If you start sprinting, it may be too difficult for your audience to keep up and they may give up halfway through. If you know you speak quickly, especially when nervous, be sure to practice slowing down and writing your self-delivery cues in your notes, see Chapter 6, to maintain a more comfortable rate. As always, recording and timing your speech during practice helps. You especially will want to maintain a good, deliberate rate at the beginning of your speech because your audience will be getting used to your voice. We have all called a business where the person answering the phone mumbles the name of the business in a rushed way. We aren't sure if we called the right number. Since the introduction is designed to get the audience's attention and interest in your speech, you will want to focus on clear delivery there. Regulating rate is another reason why video recording yourself can be so helpful because we often do not realize how fast we speak. Pauses. The common misconception for public speaking students is that pausing during your speech is bad, but that isn't necessarily true. You pause in normal conversations, so you shouldn't be afraid of pausing while speaking. This is especially true if you are making a particularly important point or want for a statement to have a more powerful impact. You will want to give the audience a moment to digest what you have said. For example, consider the following statement. Because of issues like pollution and overpopulation, in 50 years the Earth's natural resources will be so depleted that it will become difficult for most people to obtain enough food to survive. Following a statement like this, you want to give your audience just a brief moment to fully consider what you are saying. Hopefully they will think something along the lines of "What if I'm still alive then?" Or "What will my children do?" and become more interested in hearing what you have to say. Of course, there is such a thing as pausing too much, both in terms of frequency and length. Someone who pauses too often, after each sentence, may come off seeming like they don't know their speech very well. Someone who pauses too long, more than a few seconds, runs the risk of the audience feeling uncomfortable or, even worse, becoming distracted or letting their attention wander. We are capable of processing words more quickly than anyone can speak clearly, which is one of the reasons listening is difficult. Pauses should be controlled to maintain attention of the audience. At various points during your speech, you may find yourself in need of a brief moment to collect your thoughts or prepare for the next section of your speech. At those moments, you will be pausing, but we don't always like to let people know that we're pausing. So what many of us do in an attempt to trick the audience is fill in those pauses with sounds so that it appears that we haven't actually paused. These are known as vocalized pauses, or sometimes fillers. Another term for them is non-fluencies. Everyone uses vocalized pauses to some degree, but not everyone's are problematic. This obviously becomes an issue when the vocalized pauses become distracting due to their overuse. We have little doubt that you can remember a time when you were speaking to someone who said the word, like, after every 3 words and you became focused on it. One of your authors remembers attending a wedding and, inadvertently, began counting the number of times the best man said, like, during his toast. 22 was the final count. The most common vocalized pause is, but then there are others. Can you think of any? The bad news here is that there is no quick fix for getting rid of your vocalized pauses. They are so ingrained into all of our speech patterns that getting rid of them is a challenge. However, there is a 2-step process you can employ to begin eliminating them. First, you need to identify what your particular vocalized pause is. Do you say, well, or now, before each sentence? Do you finish each thought with, you know? Do you use, like, before every adjective, as in, he was like so unhappy? After figuring out what your vocalized pause is, the second step is to carefully and meticulously try to catch yourself when you say it. If you hear yourself saying, remind yourself, I need to try to not say that. Catching yourself and being aware of how often you use vocalized pauses will help you begin the process of reducing your dependence on them and hopefully get rid of them completely. One of the authors uses a game in her class that she adopted from a couple of disc jockeys she used to hear. It is called the game. The callers had to name 6 things in a named category. Items in a refrigerator, pro football teams, makes of cars, etc. In 20 seconds without saying a vocalized pause word or phrase. It sounds easy, but it isn't, especially on the spot with a radio audience. It is a good way to practice focusing on the content and not saying a vocalized pause. The 10 items listed above represent the major delivery issues you will want to be aware of when giving a speech, but it is by no means an exhaustive list. There is, however, one final piece of delivery advice we would like to offer. We know that no matter how hard you practice and how diligent you are in preparing for your speech, you are most likely going to mess up some aspect of your speech when you give it in class, at least a little. That's normal. Everyone does it. The key is to not make a big deal about it or let the audience know you messed up. Odds are that they will never even realize your mistake if you don't tell them there was a mistake. Saying something like, I can't believe I messed that up, or, can I start over? Just telegraphs to the audience your mistake. In fact, you have most likely never heard a perfect speech delivered in your life. It is likely that you just didn't realize that the speaker missed a line or briefly forgot what they wanted to say. As has been the driving maxim of this chapter, this means that you need to practice your speech beforehand, at home or elsewhere, the way you will give it in class. Since you know you are likely going to make some sort of mistake in class, use your practice time at home to work on how you will deal with those mistakes. If you say a word incorrectly or start reading the wrong sentence, don't go back and begin that section anew. That's not what you would do in class, so just correct yourself and move on. If you practice dealing with your mistakes at home, you will be better prepared for the inevitable errors that will find their way into your speech in class. A final thought on practice. We have all heard, practice makes perfect. That is not always true. Practice makes permanent. The actions become habitual. If you practice incorrectly, your performance will be incorrect. Be sure your practice is correct. 11.5. Expert advice on the voice from an acting instructor. Mr. Chad Daniel, lecturer in theater at Dalton State College, explains some vocal exercises that can help students with volume, pitch, variety, and expressiveness. Mr. Daniel has extensive professional experience in acting, directing, and teaching. When I teach voice, I never talk about volume. I talk about breath support. When I tell a student to make something louder or softer, it teaches them to push or hold back without breath or body connection, so it's all in their throats. What I want them to think about is directing the breath energy around the sound, voicing. When I teach acting, I talk about making something more urgent or important, and that will naturally increase or decrease the volume. The damage done to a voice comes directly from sound that is not supported by breath. The breath should be doing all the work, and the voice should be doing the articulating. An example might be if I grip the heavy bar for 100-pound weight with my just fingers, I am going to damage them. My hands supported by my biceps and triceps should be doing the heavy lifting. Another example might be, the breath is getting the sound out there, while the voice is doing the communicating. The increase or decrease of volume should come as a byproduct of more or less breath energy and the urgency of the message. Breath and voice connection comes directly from a consistent practice, which involves warming up and exercising the voice. This work should involve the whole body. First finding where tension is living within the body, then releasing that tension through breathing, stretching, and the creation of sound. Tension is an enemy to the voice, so this work is doubly important to novice speakers because of nerves and inexperience. Here is a warm-up exercise I use in the classroom. 1. Find a spot in the room where they have enough room to extend their arms out to the side without touching anyone else. 2. Find a neutral stance, with feet parallel, about shoulder width apart, and knees should not be locked. 3. At your own pace, close the eyes and let your attention drift inward. Rock forward onto the toes, then back onto the heels, finding the sweet spot in the middle where they are not using much muscular control to keep themselves upright. The skeleton should be doing the supporting. This is the point where the awareness starts to come into the breathing. I think terminology is important, so I never say take a breath. I say allow the breath to drop in, and allow the breath fall out, continuously reminding the students throughout the course of the warm-up. They are not vocalizing at this point, it is all just focusing on the breath. 4. Slowly let the head drop over, chin to chest, and roll down the spine one vertebrae at a time, on a 10 count. 5. At this point they are hanging over like a rag doll, knees are slightly bent, neck is released, and arms are released and flopped over. This is not as much of a stretch as it is a release. The weight should still be in the middle of the feet. I tell students to imagine the feet are like hands gripping the floor. 6. While dropped over, make sure they are not holding on with the neck. Shake the head no and nod the head yes to facilitate the release. The head should be floppy, and eyes should be looking at shins, not the ground. If you are looking at the ground, then there is tension in the neck. Have students place their hands on the lower back and breathe into the hands. You want the students to start to understand how to make lots of room for breath. 7. After 3 breaths dropped over, they should begin to roll up the spine on a 10 count, all while continuing to check in with the breath. Once they reach the top of the spine, the head should remain dropped over. Once here, use the hands to place the head back on top of the neck, giving it an extra gentle lift. You want them to think about extending the neck, opening the channel, and making more room for breath. Ask speakers to check in with their bodies and try to find out where the movement is happening when they breathe. Most will be in the shoulders, but you want to get them to try and have this breath movement happening in the lower ribs and the belly. If the movement with the breath is happening in the shoulders, then there is still tension and they are not going to be fully utilizing the breath. 8. Have them bring the focus back inward, closing eyes if they want, and begin touching sound. Like I said before, it is just a gentle tap of sound. Ha. The first H of ha is very lightly tapped. If they come in too strong with this initial sound, it is going to create a glottal stop, which can cause tension in the vocal folds. In order to counteract this, that initial H sound must be almost inaudible. 9. Students go up to the balls of their feet, then extend out through the arms, making themselves as tall and wide as possible, all while touching the ha sound. They stay extending for 3 breaths, continuing to touch sound. 10. Release the arms, then the feet, leaving the neck extended. At this point, the feet are flat on the floor, but the neck is fully extended. They continue the ha sound, extending it more and more for each breath, until it is extending out to the end of their breath. X, ha, hua, 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 hua. The length of the word gets bigger, not the energy exerted on it. In other words, it doesn't get louder, just longer. All of this done while continuously reminding them to support with breath. So the more sound that comes out, the more breath should be behind it. Vocalization should never be unsupported. 11. At this point, students should pick a spot somewhere in the room and send their huzz to that spot. Imagine that your sound is a laser beam and you are drilling a hole in the wall with it. Then imagine that the sound is something soft like a pillow and throw pillows at the wall with the sound. Then imagine it is something else and send that to the wall. The location that they are sending the sound to should be at 10-15 feet away. 12. Once the student has practiced sending sound out for a bit, have them drop their chin to their chest, hold it for a breath, then roll the right ear over the right shoulder. Hold it for a breath, then left ear over left shoulder. Hold it for a breath, and finally back to chin to chest. All of this while touching sound. Have them hold the ridge of the jawline using only the thumb and forefinger, waggle the jaw up and down, never side to side, and put some voice behind that. If they are having trouble moving the jaw up and down, it means there is tension in the jaw muscles. Next, have them hold the bottom jaw in place and lift the top jaw off of the bottom, then bring bottom to the top, bottom off top, bottom to top, all the way until their mouths and throats, channels, are wide open, and they are facing the ceiling. Send the sound to the ceiling. After sending sound, bring head forward leaving the channel open and send sound to wall. Bring head down leaving channel open and send sound to the floor, then come back to center. This helps them to open their soft palates and throats, to fully resonate the sound out. 13. At this point, have them use their hands and place it on a certain spot on their bodies, like a hand on the belly, and send the sound from that spot. This is all imagination work, but it is really effective. Let them know that they are not really sending sound from that spot, but it should feel like they are. Closing parenthesis. 14. Have them come to a neutral stance, close the eyes again, and imagine that their body is a big empty vessel with a little bowl at the bottom, right about where their pelvis is, and each time the breath comes in, it scoops into that bowl and comes back out. This is about making lots of room for breath. They should be ready to start giving lines from their speeches with the breath. So, instead of ha, they would say a word or two from their speeches. Ask them to think up theme words from their speeches and put those with the breath. This will start to facilitate the connection of mind, breath, and voice. 15. Lastly, have them move around the room communicating that word with other members of the group as they pass each other. This is a lot of information, but this warm-up only takes about 10 minutes at the most. Pitch and volume should both be a byproduct of urgency of message. If you connect the speech with the breath, and know what you specifically want to do with your speech, then volume and pitch can happen spontaneously, and there will be no need to plan these elements out. Conclusion. Good delivery is meant to augment your speech and help convey your information to the audience. Anything that potentially distracts your audience means that fewer people will be informed, persuaded, or entertained by what you have said. Practicing your speech in an environment that closely resembles the actual situation that you will be speaking in will better prepare you for what to do and how to deliver your speech when it really counts.